Hi, my name is Kaylin Caballero, and I work at the marketing department for the 355th Force Support Squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona. Today we're speaking with Vanessa Wyche. She is the Deputy Director of NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, as well as the Chair of the Board for Space Center Houston. She has worked at NASA for 31 years and is a passionate promoter of science, technology, engineering, and math. I am so incredibly honored to have the chance to speak with her about her career, her favorite projects, and what you can do to work at NASA too. So sit back and enjoy our conversation. Welcome, Vanessa. It is such a pleasure to meet you, and I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Awesome. I'm excited to talk with you as well.
Okay, so we've got a few questions. The first one is, have you always worked in space? And along your career, who have been your role models and your mentors?
Okay. So actually, I started my career. I have a master's degree in bioengineering. And I started my career with the Food and Drug Administration, who's getting a lot of attention right now, and in Washington, D.C. I was a medical device evaluator, evaluating things like hip implants and surgical hardware, in addition to diagnostic hardware, lasers, ultrasound, etc. I actually loved that job. I thought it was the greatest job to ever have. But I actually met a young man who was finishing law school, and he was a native Houstonian. And so he asked me to marry him. And I said, well, I got to find a job in Houston. And so we decided we'd move to Houston, and I was fortunate to land a job at NASA and have loved it ever since. So coming to NASA was my first soiree into space, and I was the first job I had was building hardware to do tests on astronauts, and which is great. As a young project engineer, I came in and right away had mentors available to me that taught me everything that they knew about flying hardware in space and working with the astronauts on how to test them and make sure that we got all of the data that we needed for the scientists that were needing information. And so mentoring has always been a big part of who I am, because I've been mentored, and I am a strong believer and supporter of mentoring. And so I mentor others. Right now, I mentor people at the Johnson Space Center. I mentor people at our Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where we actually launch, and as well as in Alabama, where they actually build the rockets. So, and in addition to that, I mentor others outside of NASA as well. And even for myself, though, I continue to have great mentors that I have access to within NASA and people that are retired, as well as in other industries. But have I always wanted to work in space was, I think, maybe a part of what you were pulling at. And growing up as a little girl in South Carolina, I always loved being outside and studying nature and science. And I actually liked rocks a lot. And I wanted to be a geologist when I was a kid, but I didn't know any geologists. And so when I went off to college, I knew of people that did biology, and I loved biology, so I started as a microbiology major. The operative part of that word is micro, which included microscopes, and I found out that I wasn't a big fan of microscopes. So I switched to engineering and have loved it, have figured, ways of solving problems and doing analysis was really what my passion is, and so that's how I ended up being an engineer. So I have an undergraduate degree in materials engineering, and I did want to be a bioengineer, so I actually had to get a master's degree, because at that time we didn't have it in the undergraduate realm. So, but that was my true, and still is. So being in human spaceflight, I get to apply those skills every day.
That's an amazing journey. So it looks like you've worked with astronauts
pretty much your entire career with NASA. So what do your astronauts typically do after returning home from the International Space Station? And how has that changed with our current situation with COVID-19? Because I know Jessica Meir and Andrew Morgan just returned. So what's changed in the way that, you know, their interactions with people and how they return home after being in space for so long?
Yes, yeah, yes. So yes, I've had the wonderful opportunity throughout my career to work with astronauts, um, helping to launch them into space. Right now is what my main job is, because it's overseeing all of the aspects of getting astronauts. Are they trained? Do we have vehicles for them to fly on? Getting them launched into space, the activities that they do on orbit, and then when they return. Um, so I will start with a little bit of the actual launching people in space, because we're super excited right now, because we have two companies, SpaceX and Boeing, that are competing for launching our crews into space from Florida again. So we have a launch that's coming up at the end of the month. May 27th is the plan date for SpaceX to launch two of our astronauts to the International Space Station. We just launched a astronaut to the International Space Station. Chris Cassidy is on board right now, and he just got there, I guess, 2 weeks ago. And launching him in the COVID world was very interesting, because we had to make sure that, you know, all of the hardware was cleaned appropriately, so there'd be no contamination getting on board to the International Space Station, and all of the people that were in contact with him, making sure that they were tested and they didn't have an ability to transfer the virus to him. So that was quite an interesting thing to do, of getting him. So he goes up, and then so we rotate members on the International Space Station. So Jessica and Drew came home, and so them coming home and us leaving from Houston to go get them from Kazakhstan, which is a area where the Russians have an agreement for their launches, and bringing them back and getting them back. As you know, when anybody does international travel right now, you have to do 14 days of quarantine. So that even applies to our astronauts. So them coming back because they landed, and we had to pick them up and bring them back from Kazakhstan back to the United States. So they spent 7 days in what we call our crew quarters. We have a quarantine place on campus where we quarantine astronauts prior to going on missions. And in their case, they have to be quarantined on return. So they were quarantined there for 7 days. When they came back, because of the social distancing requirements, of course, we were not allowing people to hug them. And so Jessica did an interview the other day, and she was saying how she's getting used to the virtual hugs, because, you know, we can't just go up and hug them. We did have their families go into quarantine prior to them coming back, so that we knew that they did not have any COVID. And so they were able to reunite with their families in the crew quarters and be with them. And now they are home doing the last 7 days of their quarantine. So they were in a NASA facility for 7 days, and now they're at home for 7 days, finishing out their quarantine. And for them, you know, yes, it's an adjustment, because when they left, you know, we were all, you know, hugging every day and doing a lot of touching, and, you know, in close contact. And normally when crews come back home, when they come to Ellington Field, they are embraced. And so in this scenario, the people had to be 6 feet apart, and, you know, had to wave and, you know, do what we call the virtual hugs. So.
I know with deployments with the military, I mean, my husband is home, but I can't imagine him coming home after being gone for so long and not being able to immediately embrace him and, you know, shake hands with everybody that's come home with them. And so it's definitely an interesting time. And that human touch, especially after you've been in space with the same few people for so long, I'm glad that their families were able to be with them for that. So let's see. Let's go to, what kind of qualities do you look for in future astronauts to endure those rigors and isolation of space? And, you know, the prep, I'm sure, of becoming an astronaut is crazy. So what kind of qualities do you look for in someone who wants to do this?
Yeah, so we actually just finished having an open opportunity for people to apply to be astronauts. And so we had 12,000 people apply. Yes, and our astronauts are very, very highly qualified. Our workforce in general is very qualified, highly qualified. And so the previous class, we had 18,000 people apply, and this time we had 12,000. I know that the criteria this time was raised from being having a bachelor's of science to now having a master's of science at a minimum. And so with that, we have 12,000 people. We look for people with various backgrounds. So there's like not just one way to be an astronaut. Some people, you know, early on in the 50s and 60s, they were looking for pilots, looking for test pilots, and specifically. So now we have everything from pilots to medical doctors, engineers, physical scientists. We actually have an astronaut that's a geologist. And we have, let's see, I mean, just any wide variety of expertise, because when you're on board the International Space Station, we have a wide variety of science and research technology applications that are being done on board. So that's what we look for. Of course, you have to be somebody that can work in a team. It's being in the military, it's the same kind of thing. Like you said, you're working in close quarters with others. You need to be able to get along with other people. And so having that ability, working in isolation. I think you've seen, hopefully, some of the astronauts talking about what it was like Scott Kelly, I know, has been doing a lot of talking about what it was like to be on board the space station for a year. And many of the astronauts have been able to share that the isolation experience, you know, it's, you know, pacing yourself, you know, setting small goals, understanding, you know, that it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. You can have to, you know, get into it and look at the small wins that you have every day. And it helps you to be able to stay in this state of quarantine that we're all in.
Yeah, it's amazing how everyone is relating to the astronauts now, regardless of career path. So I'll jump to what kind of advice would you give to young kids and some of our airmen who would be interested in a career at NASA, whether or not it's an astronaut? Like, you know, what kind of schooling, what kind of advice would you give to them who want to work in this industry?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Right now, I was just going to share, we have about 10,000 employees at the Johnson Space Center. About 3,000 or so are civil servants. The majority, it's in our contractor community. We have, you know, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and then we have, you know, smaller companies as well that support the work that we do. Of that, the number of astronauts is like maybe 50, right? So the majority of the jobs are not astronaut jobs. And, you know, they're great, wonderful jobs. I mean, I will tell you, I love my job, and I love putting people in space. I'm not the one to be the astronaut, but my thrill is seeing them in space, you know, doing science experiments, other technology experiments, is what is my thrill. So for young kids that have an interest of space, and then there are a variety of fields that we have. So A large part of our workforce is what we call science and technologists. At the Johnson Space Center, we are a center that does operations and engineering. We do have some scientists. We have lunar scientists, because all of the lunar rocks that were brought back from Apollo, they were curated, and many of them are housed at the Johnson Space Center. Some of them are loaned out around the world for people to do research on them. But so we have a core of researchers that study astronomy, and they understand what and how the planets have developed and grown. They do the study of exoplanets and those things. Our engineering workforce, you have a lot of engineers, bioengineers, biomechanical engineers, chemical, material structures, because these vehicles that are built, these spacecraft, have to go and be tested, designed, built, and a lot of testing before we put our crew members on board for them to be launched into space. So we have a large field of engineering and different expertise there. In addition, you have to have people that help with the procurement of these items. We have lawyers, we have resource specialists, we have communication specialists to help to tell the story. So there's a large variety of jobs that are required to help us to be able to, launch the astronauts. We have medical doctors, we have nurses, we have pharmacists to make sure that they are healthy. And then we're looking at the safety and the ability for us to do testing on the astronauts, but also on the hardware. So a large array. So I would encourage any of the folks in the military, because it takes people that have leadership skills, which are things that are learned in the military, for them to apply, because we need leaders. We need people to come in. And then more also importantly, as I mentioned before, is that teamwork, right? And having folks that have that in addition to the skills. Logistics is huge. So like it's huge in the military, it's really big for us, because I mentioned to you our 10,000 people at the NASA Johnson Space Center, but there's 40,000 around the country. And then you imagine then we have a contractor workforce that is expansive of that. So we have maybe 17,000 civil servants, maybe, 40,000 in the prime community, but then vendors. I'll give you an example of something that we have the suits that the astronauts go out into outside of the International Space Station. There's materials that is required for that. Well, those materials are made by an outside vendor, and then putting those suits together, some of it is actually done by hand sewing, so we need people that are seamstress that have, in our jobs, as well as in the military, feeding the crew. We have people that are nutritionists. They go to school to learn how, what are the amounts of proteins, calories, things people need to have, and then the processing of that food. What does it take to actually make it such that it is, you can have it on board the space station for a year at a time, and it still tastes good, kind of like MREs, but but it's really good. I've gone to our food lab and actually eaten several of the food items. So, but I would encourage the students to study whatever their passion is, and do very well. We do a lot of talk around science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM. And I'm a strong believer also in the arts and being a STEAM, so that you're a real well-rounded person. But those are not the only jobs that we have. And so if your passion is space, there's a place for you. And we would love for you to join our team.
That's amazing. There really is just so much that you can do in that industry. And my part would be communications. So one final question. What has been your favorite project that you have worked on with NASA?
I will say hands down, my very favorite project. So as I said, I started as a project engineer, building flight hardware and doing testing on astronauts that flew on the space shuttle. I actually learned and gained the ability to lead, and actually became a manager of shuttle missions. And several of the missions took pieces of the space station up and were a part of the assembly. So astronauts went outside and hooked those components up to the International Space Station. So my favorite is actually on orbit and working, and it has been there, and we'll be celebrating 20 years of astronauts being on board the International Space Station continuously in November. So that by far is my favorite. It's operating any day. You can go Google ISS, and sometimes it flies over different areas of the country. So you can type in, when will the space station fly over me? And it'll come up, and you can go outside and you can look up and you can see my favorite project as it goes over your house, wherever you are.
That's amazing. I have 2 quick fire questions for you. What is your favorite planet? One.
Okay. I would say Mars. And because it's intriguing. I mean, we have rovers on Mars, and we know a lot about it. We're sending another one. I'm sure you've heard of Perseverance, and then a young lady named the helicopter Ingenuity recently. But I think that there's a lot we learn about our Earth from Mars. And so I would say Mars. Second would be Earth. I love Earth. It's a great planet.
Great planet. And if you could name a star, what would you name it?
Oh, wow. I think I would name it Love, because I think when we look up at the night sky and we see the stars, and we know that there's so much more out there than there is right here where we are. But I think what my belief is that we all thrive when we're loved. And I would name it Love, and I would think that it would be shining its love on us all the time.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, this is Vanessa Wyche. She's the Deputy Director of NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. It's been amazing to talk with you, and thank you so much for joining us via Zoom.
Oh, awesome. And please, anytime, and if you can't make it to see us at the NASA Johnson Space Center, or bring your family to visit Space Center Houston, you can Google both and join us virtually. And there's actually some virtual activities happening at Space Center Houston with some downlinks. So please go and find out, and there'll be things for you to do. And I think we shared our kids NASA at Home website that you can go to, and there's activities for children to do as well.
Yeah, we'll have all those. Yeah, we'll have all those links for everybody, so you guys can check it out. But thanks for joining us.
And I want to say thank you so much to our military, and thank you to the families. Thank you to the wives, the children. In our business, we know that it is not just the employee that is going to work every day. It's the family that's behind them. And we thank you so much for all that you do for our country. Thank you so much.
thank you so much for tuning in. If you want to learn more about NASA and all the amazing projects they are working on, go to nasa.gov. And for some fun games and activities for your kids, go to spaceplace.nasa.gov. This concludes our Intergalactic Quarantine Quest. Congratulations to all of our prize winners. We hope you all had fun and learned some great things about space along the way. Until next time.